Ford Motor Company, back in the early 80s, was on the ropes. They weren't doing well financially. The only thing keeping them afloat at the time was the Ford F-150, their truck business. So they were really looking to come out with a new midsize sedan, which eventually was the Ford Taurus and its twin, the Mercury Sable. Long story short, the program manager associated with the effort was like, "Hey, you know what? We need 6 to 8 more months. We need to delay the introduction of the Taurus because we can include a couple more features that really could be a game changer for us in the industry." Customers, are, testing with them, with our target audience. They seem to really like this. I think it's worth waiting. Let's do it. They did. The Taurus launched. It was a huge success. It was the best-selling car in America for 3 or 4 years in a row. It saved the company. And do you know what, happened to the program manager in charge of the effort? He was fired. He was fired, or she was, I think it was a he. He was fired because the project was, quote, unquote, "late," and therefore, according to internal Ford standards, the project was a failure. So what are you focusing on? Now, the other thing along those lines, individuals within the organization learned, "Oh, you know what? If I've got a critical effort here at Ford, I'm not gonna make that mistake. Who wants to get fired?" So when it came time for the redesign back in, let's say, the early '90s, the program manager, basically met scope, schedule, and cost, delivered, on all those areas, and the Taurus was never quite the same. It was a redesign, didn't really resonate in the marketplace. Now, which one was a project failure? So to me, it always tracks back to what are you measuring? What you measure matters.
All right, welcome everybody back to the Sean Trey Show. I am your host, Sean, and I've got an awesome guest with me today and with us today. Can you introduce yourself and tell people who you are and a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, Sean, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I am Mark Werner. I am currently a consultant. Long story short, I've been in the project delivery space for a good 15 plus years and working with either direct for organizations or consulting with them with respect to PMO, project management office stand up or optimization. So, again, really just around project delivery, standards, excellence of an organization.
That's awesome. How did you get started down that path? What was it that started you down this path to see, what it is that you wanted to do?
Yeah, it was a bit of a winding road. So after I get out of my master's degree program, was an analyst. And long story short, started to really kind of pick up on project management techniques and had an opportunity at Siemens Medical many, many years ago to lead a pilot scrum team, which is an agile team for project delivery, and really liked it and got a you know uh, built-in passion for that. So I've really built up expertise in both agile delivery as well as, we'll say, traditional waterfall delivery as well. So it's since been 2006 and I've been in the project delivery space.
That's awesome. It's interesting too because I love project management because um, working with projects is the art of getting things done. And I think a lot of people are not aware of what is required to actually get things done. So you're going to clean your room. Well, even that is kind of challenging at times. How are you going to break it down? What are you going to do first? Where are you going to work it? Now, let's imagine that you need to clean 2 rooms. Okay, a little bit harder. 3 rooms, and you're bringing other people in to help you. All right, 25 rooms. Well, how are you, doing 25 rooms? That gets really complicated, and you have to deal with, well, maybe something else. Maybe you only have 2 vacuums, even 2 vacuum cleaners. Well, how are you gonna work that? What room needs to get done first? Are you doing the bed sheets? You have all these different things, and so for people who don't understand that, there's a lot of pieces that go into any type of project that things have to get done, and like building a house, I'm always fascinated by that because you can't put the roof on until you have a foundation,
Exactly.
Things have to go in a certain order, and if you do it wrong, you're gonna if you have your roof people there on day 1, they're gonna be like, "Dude, what are we doing?" And you're wasting money and you're wasting people's time.
Right, meters running,
Yep.
expenses add up. You do things like that, exactly.
I wanted to ask you about, what does a PMO actually mean? Like, what do you really do day to day?
So that's a great question. The P in the PMO can stand for one of three things: project, program, or portfolio. So, the P always I always ask, what's the P stand for? Now, typically, you can glean that a lot of times. So we'll start like, if it's a portfolio, typically organizations will write an EPMO, which is an enterprise portfolio management office. So governing the entire enterprise, right? Really aligned to ensure that the strategy is embedded in the various programs and projects that align underneath or within the respective portfolios. Um, Other organizations, they're fine with just a program management office. It really depends on the size of the organization, and really what their intent is from a project delivery standpoint. How are they going to drive those things? How large are their efforts? Um, so it also depends, again, going back to the size of the organization. Smaller organizations will have we'll say, loose project management offices. Maybe they're concerned if it's a smaller startup and they're getting to the point where, hey, they need, some sort of formalized process. Going back to your example with respect to, hey, we're a cleaning company. We're going into office space, or hotel or houses. How do we structure things, right? So they might just, an organization that's IT related, here's a couple templates we'll use, what have you. As a company grows, they typically get more structured with respect to their PMOs and what is expected to the point where a lot of times you'll get more directive PMOs where they have project managers, or if they're agile in nature, scrum masters, release train engineers who are responsible or accountable for delivery success. So from a day-to-day perspective, it depends. So if we take a project manager, it could be, working with stakeholders to what's the project charter? What is this thing about? Understanding that. To your point, starting to align what are the resources we need? And that's not just human resources. It could be, hey, we're building an office space. Well, what are the various resources from construction to um, the various different tradesmen that are required, what have you, that are involved in that. An eye towards budget, right? Scope. What's the initial scope that was set? Do we have scope creep? That is extended out. That's going to impact our delivery dates and overall budget as well.
I love that. Well, one of the things too, like, I wanna ask it because I put together some questions that are kind of very focused, but also, like, real world questions. Like, when someone says they're busy all day, but nothing actually gets done, what's happening there, you know?
Yeah, it's a bit of a black hole. So, is it tasks that aren't generating any value, that aren't you know visible to the customer? I mean, you really want to focus not so much on tasks, but on outcomes.
Yeah.
That's a big driver for customers, right? And for organizations is, it's not enough just to say, "Hey, I've got X number of tasks." That's great. Is it deriving any value? What's the value to the customer or the organization?
I love that. I love that so much, man. And one of the other things too that I think that is important um, is figuring out what's essential. You know, what are the things that are most important to get the whole process moving forward? And I want to ask you this too, because have you ever worked with someone where everything feels harder than it should? Like, what's going on? Is that a company culture thing?
So a lot of times that has to do with, yes, it could be company culture, could be the industry with they're in. Maybe they're, highly regulated,
Mm.
Department of Defense, what have you. So that could be a consideration. Or it's just they're an older company and a level of calcification has occurred, right? So high degree of bureaucracy exists within the organization. So we were talking about earlier, like there's different, from a broad level, traditional waterfall approach. which is very structured. You get your requirements, you plan, um, you do design, you develop, you implement, and 18 months later, you release a product to the customer. Whereas agility is really focused on shortening up those cycles. So it's when you get value into the hands of customers sooner. Right. So hopefully breaking down, that whole, we'll say calcification that exists within organizations or some organizations, I'll say.
I love that. It makes a lot of sense because, you know, figuring out the ways those things work make a lot of sense because, one of the things that I think about is, what you just said there, this calcification, but like I always wonder why do some companies move so slow? And that kind of looks at that same concept, you know?
Yeah, I've been part of, we'll say transformations, right? So literally being brought in to help to uh, remove some of the processes that aren't adding value, right? So I was part of one organization where I was brought in to help optimize and streamline their PMO. And one of the existing leaders of the PMO said, "Oh no, we've got a checklist, and this checklist for when we get projects started is just like how a pilot would use a checklist when before they're taking off a plane." And it was like a checklist of 75 things, and I'm sitting there, I'm looking like, "That's nice. Can we lean this out? Do you really need to do this?" And really, what that checklist of 75 things was if ever there was any sort of issue in the past, it was, okay, we need to account for that in the future and put this on this checklist, even though it might not be applicable to projects down the road. You know what? We have a sense of security. Let's put it on this checklist so it never happens again. Well, there's other ways to track that is, what's in your process? Was it a process issue that you need to account for this in a checklist? Was it a one-off? Was it the project manager that was leading the effort that maybe wasn't aware of things? You know, so there's multiple factors involved when doing that. And really it gets down to, train your people well, trust, if you get good people, trust them, give them the intent and they're closest to the work, let them, help hold them accountable to drive results.
I love that. One of the parts that I love about that is that it's also simplifying things. You train people, you have the pieces in place, but like I was finding that when we make the steps too complicated to do something for my teams, they don't get done or they don't get done correctly. And you have to simplify it like, all right, guys, these are the essential steps. This is what must get done first. And we worked through that. And it was able to like get people to kind of begin to iterate upon that. Like, okay, we got our I've been trying to implement Scrum into my video workflow where we have our backlog and then we have our sprint. And this is what we're doing in our sprint. This is what we have to get through today. And it's interesting because it works a lot better when I have people focusing on one thing. Like we need to export these videos. These videos are our priority right now. But what about all these 12 other things? Not important. Today, one of the guys was like, "Hey, what about these 3 new videos?" I said, "We're working on this one right now. Did you finish these 3 things I asked you?" "Well, no." And I said, "Then don't even think about the other one yet, because if we get split between 3 different things, it's gonna cause a problem for us." And we were just really hammering away one at a time, and it was allowing us to kinda simplify and make things work, but sometimes people feel like these they need to be doing more, you know? And if they're not, they're wasting time. How would you respond to someone who says that?
Oh, you hit the nail on the head. So that's a common thing that, in the agile transformation space, you know, a deadly sin is context switching, right? Moving from one piece of work, not really finishing it, and then going off to another. Task switching, context switching. And so what we find is that quality is lower as a result because you start to ramp up on one particular task, stop, go over to another, and then you have to ramp up on that one. Whereas if you take one task and finish to completion, you actually get it done faster. Right. So there's more quality involved in that. And it's that old phrase is stop starting and start finishing.
Mhm.
right? So
Right?
it's really vital. And so in other words, if certain tasks and if you line them up, prioritize them, um, result in, some sort of, whether it's a new, a slightly different process, or in your case, some videos, that's value into the hands of your customers sooner. So
Yep.
that's why you want to stop starting and start finishing.
100%. It's like, and if you get too many things done, I remember as a kid, my mom would let us do one activity, one toy, one game at a time. If you open up 20 puzzles, that puzzle's not getting done. So we would finish one puzzle at a time, and she wouldn't let us open a new puzzle till the old puzzle was done.
Mhm.
And, we got puzzles done. I got a lot of puzzles done because I was able to kind of focus in like that. And I wanted to ask you then, because, puzzles are one thing, but what's the difference between a company that gets things done and ones that just talk about it? Companies that just say, "Rah, rah, rah," but they're not getting things done. They're not delivering.
For me, in my experience, that comes down to leadership, right? So in
Yeah.
other words, leadership sets, what's the strategy over the course of the next 3 to 5 years? What are we going to do within the next 1 to 2 years to start to realize that longer term strategy, right? Do they have a proper roadmap? Do they have OKRs, objectives and key results, that are going to get embedded into each of the, we'll say, portfolios, areas within the organization that align up to the corporate strategy, right? That's key. The other thing that I would say is companies that get things done is they're responsive from a marketplace perspective. So they don't lose sight. The more successful ones that get things done don't lose sight of their entrepreneurial or small startup, perspective, which is to stop or pivot or persevere. So if something's not working, they change. Maybe they change with respect to who are they going to sell to, change the product. Tesla is a prime example of that. Currently, um, you know, did a phenomenal job with respect to bringing about electric vehicles that were more mainstream in the marketplace. They're at the point now, though, they're retiring two of their, we'll say, major vehicles. That's the Model S that was really, it was huge in the scene back in 2012, um, and the Model X. The Model S, the sports sedan has more competition from Lucid, from other manufacturers, we'll say the legacy manufacturers as well. So, Elon and Tesla are moving into Optimus robots. They're moving into, they've already moved into, but they're also pushing the charger stations. So it's really, pivoting when market conditions change. And it's being smart about it as well.
That's so interesting. Because you think that you just have to keep pushing and be good at one thing. But the reality is that sometimes you have to pivot. You have to see where things are going and to shift with that, And maybe I was reading about some famous companies that started as one thing and became something completely different. And that's
Oh yeah.
fascinating to me.
Oh, there's many of them, like Nokia, the Nokia phones of the early 2000s that everyone had. I think they were like a rubber manufacturer back in the day, and they just transitioned. Um, you know, household uh, lubricant, we know WD-40. That started off as was used military purposes to keep rust off of Atlas rockets. Right? How do we pivot? How do we go into a different marketplace? Oh, well, it's also great for lubrication for locks and doors and stopping the squeaks. So that's interesting. The fact, WD-40, right? Do you know what WD-40 stands for?
No.
WD-40 is water displacement 40th formula. So they finally got it right on the 40th try, where it was, hey, this stuff is really good. They kept iterating, kept trying.
Yeah. Right? I love that. That's awesome. I didn't know that about WD-40, but that's super interesting because, man, 40 times they were sitting there like, "Did we
Mm,
get it yet? Nope.
yeah,
Number
like a
38. Let's
gene.
keep going." Well, it leads me to my next question of like, why do projects fail, like, even when smart people are working on them, and what should they do to succeed?
So that's an interesting question. One of the And yes, right. A lot of projects fail. And the question I always have is, what are the measures of failure? Right. And the reason I'll bring this up is, the traditional measure of a project failing is the quote unquote the iron triangle, right? Scope, schedule, cost. Right. The project exceeded its timelines in the form of the schedule, exceeded its budget. It's a failure. One of the things that I always, think about when somebody says project failures, what are you focusing on? What's the focus of the failure? So, like we were talking about before, tasks are just kind of outputs, right? But what about value? And so, how does this track back to project failure? Um, One of the examples that I love to go back, and it's a little bit dated, but I think very applicable. Ford Motor Company, back in the early '80s, was on the ropes. They weren't doing well financially. The only thing keeping them afloat at the time was the Ford F-150, their truck business. So they were really looking to come out with a new midsize sedan, which eventually was the Ford Taurus and its twin, the Mercury Sable. Long story short, the program manager associated with the effort was like, "Hey, you know what? We need 6 to 8 more months. We need to delay the introduction of the Taurus because we can include a couple more features that really could be a game changer for us in the industry." Customers, are testing with them, with our target audience. They seem to really like this. I think it's worth waiting. Let's do it. They did. The Taurus launched. It was a huge success. It was the best-selling car in America for 3 or 4 years in a row.
Yep.
It saved the company, and do you know what, happened to the program manager in charge of the effort? He was
No.
fired. He was
Why?
fired, or she was I think it was a he. He was fired because the project was, quote, unquote, "late," and therefore, according to internal Ford standards, the project was a failure. So what are you focusing on? Now, the other thing along those lines, individuals within the organization learned, "Oh, you know what? If I've got a critical effort here at Ford, I'm not gonna make that mistake. Who wants to get fired?" So when it came time for the redesign back in, let's say, the early '90s, the program manager, basically met scope, schedule, and cost, delivered, on all those areas, and the Taurus was never quite the same. It was a redesign, didn't really resonate in the marketplace. Now, which one was a project failure? So to me, it always tracks back to is what are you measuring? What you measure matters.
That's interesting. What you measure matters. It really is, and like, you know, and that leads to my next question. Like if a company or even a person has too many projects going on, how do you decide what actually matters? Like you got 20 things to do on your to-do list as a parent, or for as a business owner. What's the thing that how do you identify what's actually going to move the needle?
So yeah, that's common, right? So to me, when you have three different, four different areas that are number one, really, none of them are what's number one? So organizations that get around this have a clear delineation. And this goes, is back to what you were talking about before is um, objectives and key results. What's the strategy of the organization? Or even take it from a portfolio perspective. Um, from a portfolio perspective, we've got these particular objectives which align to the corporate strategy. That should provide guidance with respect to what are the efforts priority lined up. I had this discussion actually earlier in the week with respect to, hey, we've got competing priorities, which a lot of organizations do. How do we get to a number one? And so it really comes down to, the prioritization methodology you use, and it should be focused on value. What's most valuable for the organization to have? Every organization has limited resources. So what do we deliver first? A lot of times it's what value can we get into the hands of our customers the fastest? Because if you do that, you're hopefully beating your competition. So it really aligns to what's your overall strategy, objectives, and how can you get the value into the hands of the customers sooner? Getting that alignment is critical.
I love that. I love the idea of alignment. Like, what is, tonight I had three things going down. I had to get my daughter into her tutor. I had some podcasts, and I needed to help my wife really quick, and I kinda lined them up, and I was like, "Well, let's get this one done first. I know my daughter's not gonna be able to get herself onto her call, so I'm gonna do that first." And then I knew if I didn't say go up and talk to my wife real quick, that I would be probably, in deep trouble. So I did that, and then I came down and did my
That's
podcast, and
critical, Son. That's absolutely critical, right, exactly.
I don't need that drama in my life. No one does. But I wanna sometimes what I see with my own teams, with stuff, one of the biggest challenges is that people have a hard time figuring out what good leadership looks like when they're running a team and projects. And in your mind, what does that good leadership look like? How does a person run a good team?
So, I love to use the example, set forth by, L. David Marquette. He's author of Turn the Ship Around, former sub-commander of the USS Santa Fe. Interesting story, took over one thing from the USS Oregon to the Santa Fe, wasn't familiar with the new sub, and, he details it in the book Turn the Ship Around. He had to come up to speed. So, is he gonna, be an expert in the manual for this sub that is, yay big? No. So one of the things that he preaches from a good leadership perspective is, and it's also something that in the agile space we do as well, is empowerment. The people closest to the work typically know how best to accomplish that work. And what L. David Marquette layers in is you need to make sure that there's clarity around roles and tasks, and specifically intent. What is the intent of the project, of the effort, right? And then empower those people closest to the work to get it done, right? That is a huge game changer. And he has a very interesting, or actually I should say there's a very interesting YouTube clip. It's about 10, 11 minutes long where he details what his experience was. And it's about, okay, he empowers his bridge crew around to say, all right, we're setting out, you know, uh, is it safe to dive? And he goes, well, and he asks his people, to, all right, we're ready to dive, Captain. And he sits there as a check to go, okay, is this done? Is this done? Do you feel it's safe to dive? Okay, we're ready to dive. Let's go. Maintenance on the engines. When's a good time to do that? Well, probably not when you're in silent running, right? So the engineer will know, well, hey, you know what? Now that we come up, um, we're in a specific area of the sea. This is probably the best time to do it. It's about empowering and intent. That's what good leadership looks like.
I love that. I really love that because it's like it's something that's tangible and you can see. Um, but I've seen teams that are really interesting because everyone's working hard, but it's still a mess. Why does that happen at times?
So if it's a mess, that goes back to what's the structure that's in place, right? Are they, going back to what we were just talking about, is everyone aware of the intent? Is there clarity and alignment around shared goals?
Shared goals, man, is something that needs to be talked about more.
Like, well, is there alignment around those things? Going back to L. David Marquette, he went from a new captain on the USS Santa Fe, where I think it was a year later, because he empowered his team with shared goals and intent and authority with respect to these people know their jobs better than I do. Obviously, because they've been at it on this ship for longer. They had the best safety record, maintenance record in the fleet.
Mm.
There's tangible evidence of that.
Wait, going back to what you said about the shared goals, um, I have all of my team members, and one of the core things that I try to do is to get people on the same page, and realize that we're working together. And, you know, there's a lot of different ways to do that. One of the things that I was really happy about is that I've done my part at work, but seeing them begin to take the reins outside of work. I've seen them starting to go out for one of the guys as a two of the guys are in bands, and everyone starts going out to the music shows. They start going out to, celebrate each other, to be there for each other. And what struck me is that it's this culture thing. Like, when you can kind of there's this culture of inclusivity, of connectivity, and, like, being able to see people at a deeper level, and I'm not saying that you have to do that, but you have to be able to kind of step beyond the self. And however you as a team leader do that, I'm sure there's lots of different ways. I'm not an expert on that, but for me, we try to find shared goals and shared fun activities, and that seems to
And
work.
and it does work, and it's also you hit the nail on the head too. There's a human component to all this as well,
Yeah.
right? So, how do people work and interact? Um, a lot of times teams have shared, team agreements. How are they gonna work? How are they gonna interact? If conflicts arise, how are they gonna resolve those things? Right? Those are vitally important, right? Fostering a team that has respect for, ensuring that the team has respect for one another. Everyone doesn't always agree, but how do they, find common ground and get past, we'll say, differences of views or opinions on how work should get accomplished?
I love that. I love that. I wanted to ask you this other one because, like, sometimes projects begin to fall apart. And if a project is falling apart, um, what are the early warning signs most people miss? Because I mean, it doesn't just immediately blow up. I'm sure there's things along the way, but maybe people haven't been taught how to look for those.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Scrum teams. So in Scrum, there's a colloquial saying is, "Oh, what's the Scrum smell?" Are people
Mm.
talking to one another? Are they collaborating? Are they, doing paired development? If it's an IT related team, what's the communication? What's going back to the human element? What's the energy with respect to the teammates? Are they kind of checked out? You have people checking out, then you start to get a little cautious. Like, well, are they checking out? And if they're checking out, um, am I as a project or a team lead up to date with respect to impediments or risks, or people kind of just ignoring some things. That's usually, we'll say the first indication that something's amiss. Whether it's Scrum or even from a traditional waterfall space, what risks are getting floated? If you're seeing risks come up, that's not a bad thing. I'd rather see risks because then it means people are paying attention on the project team and elevating, say, hey, you know what, this is something we need to account for. The fact that you don't have any risks, that's usually a bad sign. That means people aren't thinking or paying attention or elevating. So those are some of the early warning signs that I always look for.
It's also something that you begin to feel. You know what I mean? You can start to feel that tension. I noticed that and I had to, as a team leader, try to shut that down. There's one of the members of my team that is extremely hardworking, but he's different. He is a very different guy, and he's goofy. I love him to pieces, but some of the other people, like, they're like, he's just not normal. He rubs people the wrong way.
Life.
And I think that one of the things that I have to do is I have to give people context. And today I sat down and everyone was, kind of getting ready to, like, kind of tease him a bit. And I was like, you know what? He works harder than almost everyone here. Like, he never slows down. And I promise you that to someone else out there, you might not be. You might be the odd one out. You might be the one that they see as different. So be slow to judge, be slow to judge. And it
No.
worked because it brought them together, and it brought them together to see that to a degree, and I'll still have to keep working on it, but, it's a step-by-step thing.
Oh, no. Yeah. And going back to the whole human element, I've seen cases where you have a high performing team and somebody new comes on board. And to your point, maybe they work a little bit differently, right? And so teams go through progressions where even though you have a team that's well functioning and high performing, if somebody new comes in with a different work perspective or style, that team literally reforms. And then they
Exact
like to go through that process of, forming, storming, where they're kind of at each other's throats, so to say, because, they're not used to this person's way of working. And then they norm. Okay, great. How, to your point, how are we going to get past this? We collectively need to get past this to make sure that we keep our eye on project delivery, on value delivery. And so there's working agreements that are in the team. Maybe people, you know, um, step up, side of the ring, so to speak, and say, hey, you know what? I when you do X, Y, and Z, this kind of grades, can you maybe change your style a little bit or your interaction and people come to agreement. I've had that in the past in scrum teams where people just clash from a personality perspective. And, I would get involved and then say, listen, you two are grown adults. I need you two to talk as well. I can't be, intermediating this like it's almost like it's kindergarten. Get them to talk. They start to norm around how they're going to work, both on an interpersonal and professional level, and then they start hopefully performing again.
I love that. I wanna ask you another question too, because, you know, if a person has a small business, what's one thing they can do to get better
Mhm.
results faster?
Oh, test and learn. Right.
Mm,
So going back to, your earlier question about, hey, how come big companies get, slow? It's that calcification in big companies, they grow over time. They move from a lean startup to they're very successful and they have different departments, marketing, sales, IT, what have you. And then people stop communicating and things take longer to get out to customers. So small business is in a great position because hopefully they can more easily test and learn, create a product or a service, get it out in the marketplace, stay close to the customer, get their feedback, their insights. One of the things in the agile community, specifically around larger companies, is that test and learn, and what we call the MVP that large companies try to use to mimic what smaller lean startups have. And that MVP is minimal viable product.
mm.
We have a hypothesis that, hey, these series of features or functions or new product is going to be a hit in the marketplace. We really don't know though. So we do just enough, right, to test that hypothesis that it's going to increase sales by 10%. So we get it out in the marketplace and either it's a hit with our target audience, it's meeting or exceeding our goals of increasing sales by 10, 20%, whatever the case may be, or in that case, we persevere. We keep adding on to that product, right? Because
Mhm.
we're close to the customer. We're getting their feedback. We're testing and learning. We're piloting, so to speak. Or you persevere or you pivot to say, you know what, the product's doing well, but there's certain features that are far more utilized than others. And there's a different customer base than we thought. So you pivot, you get that information and say, okay, great. Our hypothesis was off a little bit. How do we adjust? Because we see some promise there. So again, it's getting as close as you can to the customer, doing, really utilizing the MVP process and testing and learning, kind of like, going back to the WD-40. Oh, this formula is not right. Keep going, right? We're close to something, but not quite.
I love that. I was working through with my team some of the product offerings that we have for my company, and we were talking about it, and I was like, "Is this right? No. Is this right? No." And I kept going back to not what we thought was right, but I kept going back and reaching out to people and saying, "Hey, can I pick your brain? What do you think people actually need?" And going to some of my guests on my podcast and going, "Hey, if you were, doing this and seeking out the service, what would you really like?" And people were telling me these things, and my team and I were iterating and iterating and iterating. And finally, we came up with a really good package, and people were like, "Love this. Absolutely love this." But it took us having a bunch of humility, B, being willing to scrap everything that we thought we knew and just get back out there and start asking people about what was actually going around and what was actually being said was important. It's one thing to think, it's another thing to
Right.
actually find out, you know?
Actually, to find out exactly. So that, again, that's how large companies get around that, bureaucracy is instilling that MVP process, you know, getting a hypothesis, testing it, and then learning. And then either persevering, pivoting, or if it's a complete disaster, you stop. And you stop because there's no resonance in the marketplace. So why are you going to continue to throw resources and time, money, people at it? Right. So, just like, it's instilling that lean startup cycle with larger companies.
One of the things that I see is like sometimes I will get workers and team members that have a hard time making decisions. And when people start having a hard time making decisions, what do you
Mhm.
tell them to do to try to get beyond that?
One of the things that I do is I'll ask them, well, what do you think should be done first? What do you know? So in other words, if they're at a crossroads, I want to find out what are they thinking? They might know something that I don't. Again, proceeding from the assumption that if they're closest to the work, they have knowledge that I might not have. So I'm going to turn it back on them to say, what would you do first and why? What's causing you to stop? You've got, you seem to be at crossroads. What's something that, is causing that I might not be seeing? Right. And, if you ran the company, what would you do? You run this project. What are you going to do and why? And then you could say,
Mhm.
okay, great. Let's go.
I love that. It's empowering. It's putting the ball back in their court, a- and and like helping people understand that it's not the end of the world. If something happens, then we adapt, we pivot. And I think that like when I've been working with my daughter, I'm a black belt in judo, and
No.
today my daughter found that out. She and I studied Muay Thai together, and she was trying to show me a takedown, and I let her take me down. I knew what she was doing. It was a Muay Thai style takedown, and it was fun. And I was like, "Okay." And she's like, "See, you can't stop me." I was like, "Oh, oh, okay. I'm gonna show you a little bit about what I'm a black belt in." And, like, I just started throwing all of her and her friends around the room, and it was a lot of fun. But they were like, "Oh my goodness." And then suddenly she was like she came in and she was, like, a little bit scared, but one of the things that I've noticed that as we get more experiences, she's not afraid to try. She's not afraid to try something. You
Ooh.
know, 2 years ago, she was terrified about even walking. I tried to show her some takedowns a couple years ago, and she's like, "I'm so scared." Now she was like, "Dad, I'm gonna try that on my friends." But it's because we've created this space where she feels safe to try things, and I think that we would like to think that us adults are so different from our younger selves, but we're not really, you know? You need that degree of safety to help people feel, safe to try something, and I wanna ask you too because, how does a leader help create that feeling of safety for a team?
So great point on a number of different fronts. So it's psychological safety, right? To
Mhm,
your point, hey, I'm going to try something or I'm going to do something. And if it doesn't work out, well, I'm going to quickly learn from it. So having, a growth mindset, right? So that that mindset hopefully is fostered by the organization to say there's two mindsets you can have. A fixed, which is, well, this is the way I've always been done, and it's not really not going
mhm,
to get any better, versus a growth mindset to say, hey, you know what? I'm open to new ideas, new ways of doing things. It might be better, faster, more economical, whatever the case may be. But having that mindset and also fostering that psychological safety. I worked for an organization that was phenomenal at it. It was, let's attack the problem, not the people. And it made a world of difference. It was, if there was something wrong, it was, okay, what went wrong? Why?
mhm.
All right, let's fix it. And now it could have been, in a couple cases, it was someone didn't follow the process right, or they weren't aware of it. But it wasn't. It was. The organization and leaders there didn't get the finger ball out where it was, okay, point the finger all over the place. No, no, work with the problem, resolve it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And then what did we learn from this? Was it somebody trying something new or different? Okay, it didn't work out, or it was somebody didn't know the process. But there was a lack of punishment for that. Now, if the same person was doing the same thing over and over again, of course, a conversation would ensue. But there was a high degree of psychological safety in the organization. And going back to, points we were talking about before, that really fostered a familiar or, like a collegial aspect among teammates.
Mhm.
Let's try something new. And if you're willing to experiment and, and that keeps an organization, department, company, what have you, fresh and young, because then you are going to have that test and learn mindset. You're going to have that growth perspective and mindset as well.
I love that. I wanna ask one last question.
Please.
What's one simple habit or system that helps teams move faster and get more done?
One of the things that I was to get things done faster um, is to really focus on your flow. What's your flow of work? You had mentioned before, hey, I've got all these priorities. Everything can't be number one. What are you going to work on first? So you're focused on your flow from your intake to your overall delivery. And one of the best ways that you can do that is to visualize your work. and you visualize your work with respect to a Kanban board. It's basically just shows it's various vertical swim lanes to say intake, what's being worked on, what's being delivered to the customer. There's obviously, could be steps in between. Kanban boards are fantastic because they meet you, your department, where you are. It visualizes your current process and then shows you where the bottlenecks are. And
Mm,
so if you can resolve those bottlenecks, you get that flow more efficient, more effective, and you get, products, services into the hands of your customers as quickly as possible. One of the big things that Kanban preaches is a pull system. You don't just push, work into the next stage where it piles up. It's no, no, no. Couple individuals in implementing, for instance. There or quality assurance. Well, they can only do so much work at any given time. So let's focus on the flow. You don't overload the system. You don't overload certain steps in the system. You keep that system view in its entirety. Again, focusing on the flow, moving bottlenecks, and working with individuals and processes to get that as efficient as possible. Huge proponent of Kanban. Mm. And it's
I love that.
applicable whether you're working at a team, a program, or even I've done that at a portfolio level to get, senior vice presidents to even C-level executives insight into what work is going into their teams and what's the status of it.
Fun as well. It really breaks things down in a very simple way, and I use it. I use a lot of I use Monday.com for my team. And it allows me just to visualize things that I can see, and I show my team, this is where we're at. This is what we're working on. Though I'm a huge lover of a giant big whiteboard with stickers on it. Like that is one of my favorite things in the world.
Physical whiteboard, yeah. You just hope that the sticky holds, right? You don't want them falling off. That's the only thing you got to worry about sometimes.
Yeah, 100%. The stickiness isn't always a problem, and they end up all over my room. And I never, ever, ever have been able to succeed with those silly whiteboards, even though I love them.
With Kanban boards are great information radiator. Again, teams all the way up to executives.
Yep, it's so true. Where can people go and find out more about you and what you do?
My LinkedIn page, Mark Werner. So, you know, love to, if you have any questions, comments, I'd appreciate it. You can, message me on LinkedIn. That would be great. And Sean, before I forget, thank you again. It was a pleasure being here today.